think I wrapped it too hard.
Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. You already know it's your girl Mila, and today I am here to finally wrap up my series on how I did my plywood enclosures that you see in the background. So I realized when I was initially recording, like, first of all, it took me a couple weeks to get all of the footage that I've showed you guys so far, and I realized like I never really wrapped up the series. Like I never really showed like the final video, I would say. And so I kind of want to just do a quick overview of everything that has been discussed or maybe that I've left out as far as the construction of the enclosure. And that way we can finally end off the series right. So you'll notice I have two guys behind me. The one that you actually saw me building is the one on the bottom. And you'll notice that there's actually substrate and stuff in there. And so the only video that has not yet been released is the bioactive build. That video is going to come out after this one. So my series didn't focus on like the setup of like the hides and the enclosure and everything. It was just really on the construction of the enclosure itself. So that's why we're going to end the series with this video, and then in the subsequent video you're going to get to see me do the bioactive build if you want to check that out. If you have not seen the other videos in the series, then be sure to check out the channel and check those guys out as well if you're interested in getting a little bit more details on what we're going to discuss today. So let's just start out by saying like so let me just start out by explaining everything that's behind us. Okay, so first of all, the enclosures themselves, so the one on top I built first. I did not film that one because it was a lot of trial and error, a lot of trying to get the systems down and everything. But I did fill the one on the bottom, but they're the same dimensions. So they're both 4 feet long, 3 feet tall, and 2 feet deep. And they're actually sitting on top of each other. So in total, the whole setup is closer to 6.5 to 7 feet. And that's only because I have some spacers in between the enclosures that is giving it that extra height. So it is very tall. It is also on wheels. So I definitely recommend, if you are building some monstrosity like this, wheels are a great thing, especially if you know you're going to be moving soon. Like me, I'm going to be out this apartment pretty soon. And so I knew I needed that mobility. If you are going to be living where you're living for years to come, then maybe you're not worried about having it be mobile. But I love the fact that we put it on caster wheels, especially with me being a lone female. It allows me the ability to pull out my enclosures, vacuum behind it or whatever, and I don't need somebody here to help me move them. So that's been absolutely great having it on wheels. So just to talk a little bit more about the actual exterior of the enclosures. So they were made out of 1/4 inch thick plywood. So very affordable on the materials. I didn't want to spend a whole lot of money on the type of wood just because at that point I just felt like I could have bought a professional enclosure. So I wanted it to be kind of affordable. So we went with the plywood. So use some 2x4s and things like that. So that the 2x4 is the bigger piece of wood that you're seeing here on the bottom. Mostly everything else was done with some random craft wood and things like that. So I don't want to go too much into the actual build because that's what we had those other videos for. But I did just want to give a brief overview again. So everything was constructed out of plywood. Well, at least a majority of it was constructed out of plywood. For the ventilation, I actually used an aluminum patterned sheet, I guess, that I got from Hobby Lobby. I actually enjoyed using that as opposed to like using like an actual like AC vent or something that I've seen other people use in their enclosures. I like the aesthetic of the aluminum sheet a little bit better. So on my first build, the aluminum sheet was a little bit smaller. Like the actual ventilation hole was smaller, but on this one I actually wanted to make it bigger because I wanted to allow more sunlight to come in from the sides of the enclosure, and also just to boost ventilation, honestly. If you have an animal that is high humidity, you probably don't want a very big ventilation hole because that's going to let a lot of that excess humidity out of the enclosure, and it's going to be hard to maintain high humidity if you have extreme ventilation. So think about that when you're constructing your own enclosure. But I absolutely love the idea of having the big sun hose so the sun can peek through and help with my plant growth. So that's the overview that I wanted to give on the exterior of the enclosure. So now let's just go ahead and talk about a few more things that we touched on throughout the series. First of all, the background. So again, I constructed the background out of sheets of styrofoam and quick setting concrete. And the reason why I went with that as opposed to something like spray foam is because I wanted it to be very not permanent, honestly. So if you think about it, when people usually spray foam, it is directly adhering to the enclosure. You have to wait on that to cure, then you have to carve it, and then you have to put silicone on it and wait for that to cure. I wanted something that was, one, just less effort, very quick and to the point. But two, I wanted something that was very easily removable. So the way that I did my background is I essentially have separate panels. And so it is very easy for me to just yank those panels out of there and replace the background with something cooler or updated at the time that I want to do that. Now, I did silicone the panels to the back of the enclosure, but because there are not a whole lot of access points as far as where the silicone went, it'll be very easy for me to pull that styrofoam off the backboard. And also, I did mention this in my last video where I talked about the background, but there was a stark difference between when I first did the concrete background and then my second attempt at it. So when I first did it, I layered up the concrete really thick, and to me at the time it seemed like it was in excess. And so the next time I did the background, I did only like a really thin layer of concrete, and that I do not recommend. So if you do repeat that process, layer it up, because it will very easily chip if you do not have a thick layer of concrete, which I've noticed now in my new enclosure. It doesn't really bother me right now, but that does mean that I'll probably end up having to change out that background a lot sooner than I was expecting, which I'm not that excited about. But what the hope is also, if you throw some plants, I can also throw some more plants in there and have it kind of hide the background so that it's not that big of a deal. But I will say that some of the exposed styrofoam is kind of bothering me, so that will be a fix that I'll have to do later down the line. So some other interior elements that I want to touch on with the enclosure is waterproofing. So make sure that, this is wood, and more than likely if you have a bioactive setup, you're going to have some type of water in there. And even if you don't, I would recommend waterproofing, period, because your substrate is going to hold moisture at some point in time, and you don't want your wood to start rotting. So when I waterproofed mine, I painted the surface and then I used a polyurethane to waterproof it. Now, I was actually watching another YouTuber's channel after I had already constructed my enclosures, and he mentioned using either an oil or a water-based polyurethane. I don't know which one he had said he had used over the other. And so I didn't realize that there were two different types. So I would definitely do your research on whether to use oil-based or water-based. I believe that I used oil-based, but so there's two different types of polyurethane, and there's also other sealants that you can use. People have used like pond sealants and things like that. I wanted to kind of remain on the cheaper side of things, and I think pond sealant is a little bit more expensive, but definitely at least make sure that you do waterproof in some way. I also siliconed all of the edges in the inside of the enclosure where the wood met. That way, if I do have some standing water there at the bottom, it's not going to seep out the crevices and then onto my floor. So waterproof the inside really good. Do not forget that. And then the next element that I want to mention is my shelf. So in both of my enclosures, I did put a shelf, and the reason why I put that shelf is because I prefer using heat mats as opposed to basking bulbs. That's just my preference. And I knew that I was going to have egg crate for my drainage layer when I did my bioactive setup, so I knew it was going to be a challenge putting my heat mat on the bottom of my enclosure. And you could have put it on the side, but I don't think you get a lot of payoff when you put heat mats on the side of enclosures, especially plywood as opposed to glass. So I was like, the only way around that is to have an elevated platform and put my heat mat directly on that. That way it's off of the substrate, and I don't even have to worry about the fact that I have a drainage layer down there. So that's what I did. I put a shelf in there, I put a heat mat on there, and then I put some reptile carpet on top of the heat mat for that layer of protection, because obviously my snake can't just sit directly on the heat mat. And then I have my thermometer and everything going. So the temperatures are doing great. I will say at first I did experiment with using a seed starter mat for a heat mat instead of buying the reptile specific brand. And I ended up scrapping that idea because over the few weeks that the enclosure has been set up, the heat mat ended up kind of not getting as hot as it used to, and I ended up having to replace it with a Reptile brand heat mat anyway. So I would recommend, when it comes to the heat mat, although they can be very expensive, just go ahead and spend the money for a reputable product. Do not try to cut corners and use a seed starter mat like I did, because they're not made to do what we're trying to do with them. But it has been working out wonderfully. I will say, so my doom rose boa is on the enclosure on the bottom, and then my ball python is at the top. And I will say that she is less likely to climb than I mean, she is a ground dweller, and I knew that. And so I don't really see her in her heat spot as often, but she knows it's there and she does utilize it. But I see my ball python climbing a lot more than I see my doom rose boa. So if you have a non-climbing snake like I do, you might want to consider having the shelf a little bit closer to the ground. And actually with hers, I did move the shelf closer to the ground than with my ball python, but that's just something to consider. You have to let them know, hey, there's like every now and then, like when I first introduced her to the enclosure, I purposely put her on the shelf so she knew that was where her heat source was, and then she knows how to access it. So even though she doesn't use it as much, I do see her in there, especially sometimes after feedings. So the last element that I want to discuss with you guys is my sliding glass doors. So both enclosures have the same glass. I got my glass cut at Lowe's. I got the window track from Amazon, and then I got my finger pulls from Amazon as well. The only thing that I will say about the sliding glass, if you have an option to get thicker glass, then definitely go that route. I feel like the thicker the glass, the smoother it will slide in the window track. The window track that I have is plastic, and I just feel like it will slide so much easier, because when you have a thinner glass, even though you should be sanding the sides anyway so it doesn't cut your snake, I just feel like it is more prone to like digging in that plastic and kind of giving you friction when you're trying to pull the glass. So if you can go with a thicker window pane, do that. But otherwise, I really don't have too much issues with my glass sliding. All right, so just to show you guys, both of my enclosures have the sliding lock mechanism, and then the glass just slides like so. Really simple, really easy. Now, one thing I also want to caution when it comes to the sliding glass doors is making sure that there are no gaps, because we all know snakes are notorious escape artists. So let me bring you guys closer so I can show you what I'm talking about. All right, guys, I am sorry for the terrible glare. There's really no way around it. But basically, so here are the window pulls. These again from Amazon. I like the small footprint and that they're invisible essentially. They have different versions on the site that you can check out. So you will notice that this pane to the left has painter's tape on it. It is because it is a new pane. Unfortunately, my ball python ended up breaking her original glass. So the reason she was able to do that is because behind this decorative piece right here was a piece of wood that was there for reinforcement, and basically the wood made it so that this glass would not sit flush. So there was a little bit of a gap. It wasn't that big. It was probably somewhere closer to like that. But anyway, there was a little bit of gap between the glass and the wood. And so my ball python, she saw that as an opportunity to escape. And basically she tried to squeeze her body in between the gap. And actually she did kind of get like her nose and stuff out. So once I saw her trying to get in the little crease, I put her back in her enclosure. But of course, the thing with snakes is once they learn how to do something once, they're going to try it again. So she did it again while I was at work, and the pressure from her trying to squeeze in between that glass, and I guess the way she was putting her weight on the glass, she snapped it and the glass just broke. And so I came home from work and there was glass all over my floor. And so that could be alleviated by one, making sure there is no cracks, making sure your glass sits flush. And so I took that wood piece out, and now my glass does sit flush when I close it all the way. So I don't have to worry about that. But also if I had a thicker glass, she probably wouldn't have been able to snap it in that way. So I guess she was just really putting pressure on the glass at the right point, and it snapped. And I do have pictures that I'll insert so you can see what that looks like. One of the other issues with a sliding glass door that you want to be cautious about is there is overlap where the two panes meet. And so you want to make sure that the gap between the two panes is not wide neither, because I've had my ball python escape out of that gap too. that was easily solved. That just means that I keep my panes close together in their respective grooves on the window track. So just something to caution you about. That was basically it. So I just wanted to kind of wrap up the series on how to build your enclosure. I'm happy to go answer any questions that you guys have in the comment box below. Again, the one that you actually saw me build was the one on the bottom, but for filming purposes, it's a little bit easier just to stand up and kind of show you both of them at a glance. They were basically constructed in the same way. So the enclosures are doing very great. I am so happy that I decided to do this. Of course, when you build your own enclosures, things look a little bit more handmade, and there might be some imperfections and things like that, but that's okay. I don't mind that. You know what I mean? If I wanted it to look very professional, knowing that I'm not a carpenter or a woodworker, I would have paid for somebody else to do it, or I would have bought, you know, a commercially available one. But I love the idea that me and my granddaddy did this together, and there's a lot of love in this project. You know what I mean? So if you guys have been contemplating building your own enclosure, I say go for it. It's definitely going to be worth it in the end, but in the beginning, you might be a little stressed out, not gonna lie. So again, if you have any questions, leave them in the comment box below, and be on the lookout for the video next week on how I did my bioactive build. And I will see you guys next time. Peace.